All right, let's look at erythrocytes. All right, this is the fancy word for red blood cell. Erythro means red, and cyte means cell. So as a result, we get red blood cells. Okay, the function of a red blood cell is to transport oxygen. So we have the heart, and it is going to deliver oxygenated blood to tissue. Now, at some point, the oxygen will be delivered, and CO2 is a byproduct. So CO2 will have to get into the vein family to be taken back to the heart to eventually get reoxygenated. So red blood cells also carry carbon dioxide, transport it back to the lungs where we breathe it out, and then the red blood cells get resaturated with oxygen, and then it's put back into systemic circulation. Okay, another thing about red blood cells is they are anucleated. When you add the prefix a to a word, that means without, so they are without a nucleus. Okay, the reason for that is if a cell has a nucleus, that means it has a mitochondria, and it has all these other things that will need energy. Okay, and oxygen is a form of energy for our cells. So if the red blood cell had a mitochondria, had a nucleus, then it would consume the oxygen that is bound to it. Okay, so as a result, they are anucleated, without a nucleus. I think that's pretty clever that the human body knows how to do that. Create an efficiency where the oxygen is not utilized by the cell that's carrying it. Okay, a red blood cell has this particular look to it, where it is donut shaped, it's round, about 7.5 micrometers in diameter. And one of the things that it will have bound to it is hemoglobin. So HB is short for hemoglobin. We'll look at that in more detail in a minute. Okay, 4 oxygen can bind to 1 hemoglobin. Okay, so the green that you see here is my representation of a hemoglobin with 4 binding sites. So 4 oxygen can bind to 1 hemoglobin. 1 red blood cell has about 250 million hemoglobin. Okay, now think about that. 1 red blood cell has about 250 million hemoglobin. Now that is plus or minus, several million. It depends on the author, it depends on the book. I've seen as low as 200 million hemoglobin on 1 red blood cell, and as much as 300 million. It depends on the author. So roughly around 250 million hemoglobin on 1 red blood cell. And if there are 4 binding sites on 1 hemoglobin, so for oxygen, then that would be 1 billion oxygen on 1 red blood cell. Okay, and we have a lot of red blood cells in our body. Okay, the average person makes about 500 billion red blood cells per day. 500 with a B, 500 billion red blood cells per day. Okay, now a red blood cell lives about 120 days. Okay, so a red blood cell lives about 120 days. All right, now all the cells in our body die eventually, but they are replaced. Okay, red blood cells happen to be 120 days, so around 500 billion die per day, and about 500 billion are produced every day. Okay, the red blood cells, when it's dead, will go to the spleen. The spleen will actually process the dying or dead red blood cell. It breaks apart the components within a blood cell and sends it back to the liver to be recycled. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. So that's the fate of a red blood cell, is they do die, and then some of their components are recycled, and red blood cells are made in the bone marrow. All right, the red blood cells on their plasma membrane, which means the surface or the outer part of the red blood cell, has a glycolipid on the outer surface that determines a person's blood type. Okay, we'll look at blood types later. Glycolipids are also known as the antigen. So if you do enough reading on red blood cells, you may come across the fact that the outer coating is also known as an antigen, okay, or a glycolipid. Red blood cells also have some protein in them that creates the cytoskeleton, spectrin, and actin, and that gives the red blood cells some durability. When red blood cells are forced into tubes, they can be stretched, they can bend, they can fold, they can squeeze, but they end up springing back to their original position. When red blood cells, so we have the heart, right? So there's your pump, and it pushes blood through our tubes, and that does create what's called a laminar flow. Okay, and there's laminar flow and there's turbulent flow. Okay, so let's look at the difference real quick. Okay, laminar flow is when blood is traveling through the tube without interruption. So it's just a continual flow. And turbulent flow, there's some sort of blockage or kink. Okay, whether it's from the tube being pressed upon, or there's plaque and other buildup inside of the tube that causes a narrowing. Okay, you'll notice there's a narrowing. And what happens is it goes from laminar flow to now there's an interruption and the blood starts to swish back on itself. Okay, that's turbulent flow. And you can hear this. With blood pressure, you are taking a blood pressure cuff and putting it on a person's arm, and you are squeezing down on the brachial artery. So you're artificially kinking the tube, and that turbulent flow is called Korsakoff sound. Okay, it's named after the person that founded it, Korsakoff. So when you are taking someone's blood pressure and you're listening with your stethoscope and you start to hear this sound, you are hearing a turbulent sound, but because it's done through blood pressure, it's called the Korsakoff sound. If you hear a turbulent sound because of plaque, then it's called a bruit. Okay, pronounced bruit. So when you place the stethoscope over the carotid artery, which is in your neck, and you hear a swishing sound, that's a bruit. Okay, so that's some sort of turbulent flow, which is abnormal.